The girl's skirt rode up during the meeting, and the millionaire couldn't look away, asterisk asterisk. The conference room on the 42nd floor felt colder than it should have. Not because of the air conditioning, but because of the people inside it. Elena Hart stood near the long glass table, her fingers wrapped tightly around a leather portfolio that suddenly felt heavier than it ever had before. Around her sat men and women in tailored suits, their posture relaxed, confident, entitled. These were executives who never doubted whether they belonged in a room like this. People who had never had to rehearse their worth in their heads before opening their mouths. Elena did. Every time. She inhaled slowly, reminding herself to breathe. This was supposed to be a routine meeting. A presentation. Data. Strategy. Numbers. Things she knew better than almost anyone in the building. And yet, the moment she walked in, she felt it. The looks. The subtle pause in conversations. The flicker of surprise that crossed a few faces when they realized she wasn't an assistant. The way one man leaned toward another and whispered something with a smirk that made her stomach tighten. She ignored it. She always did. "Let's begin," said Richard Vaughn, seated at the head of the table. Richard Vaughn wasn't just any executive. He was the founder and majority shareholder of Vaughn Global Holdings, a man whose name appeared regularly in business magazines beside words like visionary, disruptor, self-made billionaire. His salt and pepper hair was perfectly styled, his suit immaculate, his presence commanding without him needing to raise his voice. This was his meeting. Elena had been invited because she had built the financial risk model that would determine whether Vaughn Global entered a multi-billion-dollar acquisition. A model no one else had been able to stabilize. Still, no one looked at her like she belonged. Richard glanced at his tablet. "We're waiting on the analyst," he said, distracted. "I'm here," Elena replied calmly. The room stilled. Richard looked up. His eyes flicked over her, once, twice, then paused just a fraction longer than necessary. Not in appreciation. In assessment. As if recalibrating expectations. "You're Elena Hart?" he asked. "Yes." A few eyebrows lifted. Someone coughed. Another executive leaned back, arms crossed. Richard nodded slowly. "All right. You may begin." The words "you may" landed heavier than they should have. Elena moved toward the screen, heels clicking softly against the polished floor. She had chosen her outfit carefully that morning. A cream blouse, fitted blazer, and a charcoal pencil skirt that fell just above the knee. Professional. Modest. Safe. Or so she thought. As she reached for the remote, her heel caught slightly on the edge of the rug beneath the table. She stumbled, not enough to fall but enough to throw her off balance for a split second. And in that split second everything went wrong. The hem of her skirt caught on the chair behind her. Fabric tugged. Rode up. Too far. The room went silent in a way that had nothing to do with respect. Elena froze. She felt the rush of heat first. Then the awareness. Then the humiliation. Sharp, sudden, all-consuming. She tugged the skirt back down immediately, her movements quick and controlled, her face calm in a way that betrayed the storm raging beneath her skin. But it was already done. She saw it. The way one man's lips curved into an amused smile. The way another executive's eyes flicked away too late. The whisper. Low, barely audible but unmistakable. Unprofessional. Someone chuckled. Richard Vaughn didn't laugh. He didn't look away either. His gaze lingered, not openly, not crudely, but long enough for Elena to notice. Long enough for something unreadable to pass through his expression. Surprise perhaps. Curiosity. Or something else entirely. Then he cleared his throat. "Go on," he said. Just like that. As if nothing had happened. As if her dignity hadn't just been dragged across the floor. Elena swallowed. She could have apologized. She could have shrunk. She could have rushed through the presentation just to get out of the room. Instead, she straightened her shoulders. And she spoke. "Thank you for your time," she began. "I'll be presenting the risk exposure and long-term yield projections for the Ardent acquisition." Her voice didn't shake. That alone seemed to disappoint a few people. She clicked to the first slide. Graphs appeared. Clean. Precise. Elegant. For the past 6 weeks, the acquisition team has struggled to reconcile Ardent's short-term profitability with its long-term volatility, Elena continued. The problem isn't revenue. It's debt structure. A man near the end of the table frowned. "We've already reviewed." "With respect," Elena said gently, cutting in without hesitation, "you've reviewed surface-level projections. What you haven't accounted for is the deferred liability embedded in their offshore subsidiaries." Silence. Richard leaned forward slightly. Elena clicked again. This model adjusts for currency risk, regulatory changes in 3 jurisdictions, and a debt rollover schedule that doesn't appear on Arden's public filings. Someone straightened in their chair. Another executive leaned closer to the screen. Elena kept going. 10 minutes passed. Then 20. By the 30-minute mark, no one was whispering anymore. They were listening. Even so, she felt it, the resistance, the unspoken question hovering in the air. How did someone like her know this? When she finished, the room remained quiet. Richard Vaughn studied her for a long moment. "That's thorough," he said finally. It wasn't praise. But it wasn't dismissal either. "We'll review," he added. "You're dismissed." "Dismissed. Not thank you. Not excellent work. Just dismissed." Elena nodded, gathered her portfolio, and walked out with the same steady pace she had walked in with. Only when the elevator doors closed did she let out the breath she'd been holding. Her reflection stared back at her from the mirrored wall. Composed, polished, untouched. She almost believed it. That evening she sat alone in her small apartment, heels kicked off, knees pulled to her chest. The city buzzed outside her window, indifferent. She replayed the moment over and over again. The tug, the silence, the looks. Not for the first time, she wondered if it would ever be different. People always saw her before they heard her. Always judged the cover before reading the book. What none of them knew, what no one in that room could have imagined, was that Elena Hart had learned long ago how to survive underestimations. Because she hadn't climbed her way into rooms like that by accident. She had built her life on being invisible. And soon, very soon, they were going to learn exactly who they had dismissed. They laughed after the meeting, not knowing she owned the silence ***. The whispers started before Elena Hart even reached her desk. She could feel them the moment she stepped onto the analytics floor, conversation stalling mid-sentence, eyes lifting too quickly, then darting away. The kind of attention that didn't ask questions out loud but answered them anyway. "Did you see? I heard." Apparently Elena didn't slow down. She placed her portfolio on her desk, powered on her monitor, and took a sip of cold coffee she didn't remember making. Her reflection stared back at her from the dark screen for a moment longer than she liked. Calm, controlled, untouchable. She knew better. By noon, the story had already evolved. What had been a simple accident had been reshaped into something uglier, something designed to strip away credibility. Someone had exaggerated. Someone else had added intent. By the time it reached the break room, Elena wasn't a brilliant analyst anymore. She was that girl. Richard Vaughn hadn't said a word to her after the meeting. Not a follow-up email. Not a request for clarification. Not even a neutral acknowledgement of the work she had presented. Silence. That silence weighed heavier than criticism. Later that afternoon, her manager, Claire, appeared at her desk. Claire was efficient, polished, and perpetually careful. Someone who had learned how to survive by never standing too close to controversy. "Elena," she said quietly, "can I see you for a moment?" The office door closed behind them. Claire folded her arms. "I just want to check in." Today's meeting didn't exactly go unnoticed. Elena met her gaze. "My analysis was accurate." Claire hesitated. "No one's questioning your competence." That was a lie. Or at least a half-truth. "They're questioning your presentation," Claire continued delicately. "Optics matter in rooms like that." Elena felt something settle in her chest. Heavy, familiar, exhausting. "I didn't plan what happened," she said evenly. "I know," Claire replied quickly. "But perception has a way of becoming reality at this level. You might want to be more cautious going forward." Cautious. As if Elena hadn't spent her entire career being exactly that. She nodded. "Understood." Claire relaxed, relieved the conversation hadn't escalated. "Good. Just lay low for a bit." Lay low. Elena left the office without another word. That night she didn't cry. She didn't rant to friends. She didn't spiral. She opened her laptop. The secure one. The one no one at Vaughn Global knew about. Elena Hart's life was divided into 2 worlds. One was visible. Safe. Modest. Predictable. The other was quiet, strategic, and very, very powerful. She logged into a private server, encrypted beyond what most corporate IT departments could track. Lines of data populated the screen, investments, projections, acquisitions. Numbers that moved markets. Elena didn't work for wealth. She worked around it. Her phone buzzed. An unfamiliar number. She answered calmly. "Yes." "Miss Hart," a man said, his voice respectful. "This is Daniel Klein. We need to speak." Elena smiled faintly. Daniel Klein didn't need to speak to anyone unless something significant had shifted. I assumed the Vaughn acquisition came across your desk, she said. There was a pause. It did. And your model? It's the only one that flagged the risk we were worried about. I thought it might. You didn't tell them everything. No, Elena replied. I told them enough. Daniel exhaled. Then you're certain? Completely. Another pause. Longer this time. Understood, he said. We'll move when you say. She ended the call and leaned back, staring at the ceiling. If anyone at Vaughn Global knew who Elena Hart really was, what she controlled, what she had built, what she could dismantle with a single decision, they wouldn't dare whisper her name like a punchline. But she had learned something long ago. Power didn't need to announce itself. The next day things grew worse. An internal memo circulated requesting a review of Elena's conduct during client-facing meetings. No names attached. No direct accusations. Just enough implication to make her feel exposed. She was reassigned from strategy meetings. Removed from email chains. Excluded. Richard Vaughn walked past her once in the corridor, surrounded by executives. He glanced at her briefly, not with disdain but with something closer to curiosity. As if she were a puzzle he hadn't quite solved. Elena returned the look calmly. She had lived her entire life being underestimated. As a scholarship student surrounded by privilege. As a woman in rooms dominated by men who spoke over her. As someone who didn't look like money, didn't sound like power, didn't wear arrogance like armor. They had always mistaken her silence for weakness. Soon they wouldn't. Because behind the scenes, decisions were already being made. Numbers were shifting. Calls were being placed. And Vaughn Global was standing on the edge of something it couldn't yet see. Something Elena Hart had already calculated. The room began to shift. And fear took the place of laughter ***. The first sign that something was wrong came quietly. Too quietly. Elena noticed it on a Tuesday morning, while sipping her coffee and scanning market updates on her private terminal. A subtle fluctuation, barely a ripple, passed through Vaughn Global's pre-market indicators. Not enough to trigger alarms. Not enough for analysts to panic. But enough for Elena to recognize a pattern. She set her mug down slowly. That shouldn't be happening. By mid-morning, whispers had returned, this time with a different tone. Elena, did you see the Arden numbers? She looked up to find Marcus, one of the senior analysts, hovering near her desk. His confidence was gone. Replaced by something close to unease. Yes, she replied calmly. What about them? They don't match what Vaughn projected last quarter. They wouldn't, Elena said. Those projections assumed stability that was never there. Marcus frowned. But the risk team signed off. Elena met his gaze. Did they? Marcus hesitated. That was the second sign. The third came in the form of an emergency meeting. Executives filled the conference room again, but this time their posture had changed. Laptops were open. Voices were lower. Tension crept through the air like static before a storm. Richard Vaughn stood at the head of the table, his expression sharp. We've received preliminary feedback from 2 institutional partners, he said. They're reconsidering their exposure. A murmur rippled through the room. That doesn't make sense, someone snapped. Nothing's been announced. Richard's eyes flicked to the far end of the table. To you, he said. It doesn't. Then his gaze landed on Elena. She hadn't been invited to the meeting. She hadn't even known it was happening. And yet, somehow, every conversation now curved in her direction. Miss Hart, Richard said. Care to explain? All eyes turned. Elena stood slowly. The exposure issue isn't public, she said evenly. But it is predictable. Arden's debt restructuring triggered compliance concerns overseas. Institutional investors don't like surprises. Silence. One executive scoffed. You're saying you knew this would happen? I said it in my presentation, Elena replied. It just wasn't what anyone wanted to hear. Richard studied her carefully now, not as an afterthought, but as a variable he had failed to account for. How did you know the partners would react this quickly? He asked. Elena paused. Just long enough. I've worked with them before, she said. That wasn't a lie. It just wasn't the whole truth. The room shifted. Something subtle but unmistakable changed. People who had laughed weeks ago now avoided her eyes. By the end of the day, Vaughn Global's stock dipped, only slightly but enough to spark concern. News outlets began speculating. Analysts questioned the acquisition. Internal emails grew frantic. And suddenly, Elena Hart was no longer invisible. She was inconvenient. That evening Richard Vaughn requested a private meeting. His office looked the same as before, glass walls, city lights, power carved into architecture, but the man behind the desk was different. "Sit," he said. Elena did. "I underestimated you," Richard admitted, folding his hands. "That won't happen again." Elena smiled faintly. "You weren't the first." He leaned forward. "Who are you, Elena?" The question hung between them. She could have told him. She could have revealed everything. But power, she had learned, was far more effective when it remained partially concealed. "I'm exactly who I said I was," she replied. "You just chose not to listen." Richard exhaled slowly. Outside his office, phones rang non-stop. Deals trembled. Certainty cracked. Inside, Elena Hart sat calmly, knowing something no one else did. This wasn't chaos. This was correction. And it had only just begun. The truth came out, and the millionaire realized who held the power ***. The invitation arrived just after midnight. Not an email. Not a calendar request. A phone call. Elena was sitting at her kitchen table, reviewing numbers that no longer needed reviewing, when the screen lit up with a familiar name. Richard Vaughn. She let it ring twice before answering. "Yes." "Miss Hart," Richard said, his voice controlled but strained. "I need you in the office tomorrow morning. 8 sharp. "That's earlier than usual." "This isn't usual," he replied. She smiled to herself. "I'll be there." By the time Elena arrived the next morning, Vaughn Global was already in damage control mode. The lobby buzzed with urgency, assistants moving faster than normal, executives whispering behind glass walls, phones ringing without pause. This was no longer speculation. It was crisis. Elena stepped into the boardroom to find every seat filled. People who had never bothered to learn her name now looked up when she entered. Richard stood at the front, hands braced on the table. "We've lost 3 institutional partners overnight," he said without preamble. "Another 2 are demanding reassurances we can't give." Someone spoke up. "This doesn't make sense. We haven't even finalized the acquisition." "That's exactly why," Elena said calmly. All heads turned. "The confidence drop isn't about what you've done," she continued. "It's about what they believe you don't know." A sharp silence followed. Richard looked at her. "Then tell us." Elena took a breath. And finally she stopped holding back. "Ardent's exposure extends far beyond what's on their balance sheet," she said. "There's an offshore debt chain tied to a holding entity that doesn't legally exist anymore." Gasp. "That's impossible," someone said. "No," Elena replied. "It's intentional." She clicked her remote. The screen changed. Documents appeared, legal filings, timestamps, internal communications. Things no junior analyst should have access to. The room went still. "These records were sealed," one executive whispered. "They were," Elena agreed. Until someone paid attention. Richard stared at the screen, then at her. "How did you get this?" Elena met his gaze. "I didn't get it," she said quietly. "I helped structure it." The words landed like thunder. A man near the end of the table stood abruptly. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying," Elena replied evenly, "that I've been advising private equity firms on international risk mitigation for the past 8 years. "That's impossible," someone snapped. "You work here." "Yes," Elena said. "By choice." Richard felt his chest tighten. The pieces were falling into place too quickly now. "Daniel Klein," Elena continued. "Marcus Feld. Helena Ruiz. The partners pulling out." She smiled faintly. "They answer to me." The room erupted. Questions overlapped. Voices rose. Shock turned to disbelief, then to fear. Richard raised a hand. "Enough." He turned to Elena, eyes searching her face, not with arrogance now, but with something dangerously close to awe. "You're saying you could collapse this deal entirely?" "I already have," she said. Silence. "And you chose not to," Richard said slowly. "Why?" Elena looked around the room, at the people who had whispered, dismissed, mocked, and erased her with ease. "Because I wanted to see who you were," she replied. "And now I have." Richard swallowed. The man who had built an empire finally understood something he never had before. Power didn't always announce itself. Sometimes it waited. "I underestimated you," he said again, this time without pride. "And I was wrong." Elena nodded. "Yes." "And now?" he asked. She gathered her portfolio, the same one she had carried into that room weeks ago when no one thought she mattered. "Now," she said, "you decide whether this company learns from its arrogance, or collapses under it." They judged her in silence. And paid for it out loud asterisk asterisk. The boardroom felt different now. Not quieter, but heavier. The same men and women who once leaned back with confidence now sat forward, hands clasped, eyes cautious. Power had shifted, and everyone in the room knew it. The illusion of control had cracked, and through that crack, reality poured in. Richard Vaughn broke the silence. "What do you want?" he asked. The question carried no arrogance this time. No assumption. Just honesty. Elena Hart stood at the window, looking out over the city she had learned to navigate long before any of them noticed her. Glass towers reflected the morning sun, symbols of ambition, success, and ego. She had lived in their shadows long enough to understand them better than most. "I don't want revenge," she said calmly. "That would be easy." A few people exhaled in relief too soon. "But I do want accountability." That word landed hard. Elena turned back to the table. "This company didn't just underestimate me. It created a culture where competence was secondary to comfort. Where perception mattered more than substance." Her eyes moved, one by one, across the faces in front of her. "That culture almost cost you everything." Richard nodded slowly. "You're right." Somewhere deep inside him, a truth had taken root, one he could no longer deny. He hadn't built his empire alone. He had built it by trusting people who looked and sounded like him, and ignoring those who didn't. "What are you proposing?" he asked. Elena didn't hesitate. "The Ardent acquisition will be restructured under my oversight," she said. "Not as an employee. As an independent authority." Murmurs erupted. "And second," she continued, "the internal review memo regarding my conduct will be withdrawn. Publicly." Faces stiffened. "Third," she added, "anyone who contributed to the rumors, whispers, or professional sabotage that followed that meeting will be removed from decision-making roles." One executive stood up. "This is outrageous." Elena met his gaze calmly. "You laughed," she said. "You whispered. You judged. And now you're afraid. That's not outrage. That's consequence." The man sat back down. Richard looked around the table, then back at Elena. "You'll have full authority," he said. "And my support." She nodded once. That afternoon the announcements went out. Market stabilized. Partners returned. News outlets shifted their tone from speculation to admiration. But inside Vaughn Global, something more important happened. People watched as executives who once wielded unchecked power were quietly reassigned, or escorted out. They watched as Elena Hart walked through the halls without lowering her eyes. They watched as respect replaced ridicule. Weeks later, Elena stood once again in the same conference room where it had all begun. Same table. Same chairs. Different energy. Richard Vaughn stood beside her now, not ahead of her. "Before we begin," he said, "I want to acknowledge something." The room stilled. "We failed," Richard continued. "Not because of numbers. But because we forgot a simple truth. Brilliance doesn't always arrive wearing confidence, privilege, or permission." He turned toward Elena. "And we nearly lost everything because of it." Applause followed. Not loud. Not performative. Real. Elena felt it then, not triumph, not vindication, but something deeper. Closure. Later that evening she returned to her apartment, the city glowing below her window. She slipped off her heels, sat on the couch, and allowed herself a quiet smile. She thought about that first meeting. The accidental moment. The humiliation. The silence that followed. They had seen her skirt ride up, and decided that was all there was to see. They never bothered to look higher. Never asked who she was. Never imagined what she carried. And that was their mistake. Because Elena Hart had never needed their approval. She had only needed time.